All right, everybody. Welcome to the 2022 Metropolitan Policy Center Annual Spring Lecture. Also, happy St. Patrick's Day and opening day of the NCAA basketball tournament. My name is Derek Hyra, and I am the director of the Metropolitan Policy Center, or as we like to call it, MPC. We are very excited to have you here today to listen, to learn, and engage with one of the world's most distinguished gentrification scholars. I am so glad that our guest speaker is going to focus on the pandemic and the impact it has had on gentrification patterns and trends. Before I introduce our guest speaker, let me just make a couple of acknowledgements and make a couple of logistical announcements. An event like this doesn't take place with just one person's effort. It was a total group effort, and I just want to thank my MPC staff member, Christian, who is offline and in the background and will be helping us out here. I also want to thank Dean Vicki Wilkins of American University School of Public Affairs for her great leadership and support of the Metropolitan Policy Center. I also want to thank her for deploying her staff, including Lisa Che and Mackenzie in the school's Office of Communications and Events Planning. They have really helped put this whole thing together, and I can't thank them enough. All right, in terms of the event logistics, we will have a lecture for about 30 to 40 minutes. During that lecture, there will be a Q&A sort of chat function where if questions arise that you have that you want to ask our guest speaker, please put them into the chat. We will be noting the questions, and we will leave probably about 20 minutes, and I'll be fielding those questions. And at the end, we will ask our speaker to respond to the questions that you have about her presentation. So now on to our guest speaker. For the annual spring lecture, we showcase someone whose scholarship has transformed the way we think about urban and metropolitan dynamics and life. Dr. Loretta Lees's rigorous, theory-driven, empirical urban analyses have revolutionized our understandings of the complex and multi-tiered processes and outcomes associated with gentrification and neighborhood change. Dr. Lees, a professor of human geography at the University of Leicester, takes a humanistic approach and applies mixed methods to further understandings of neighborhood change and urban inequality. Her 2003 concept of super gentrification put the gentrification concept back on the academic theoretical map, and it influenced a generation of urban scholars. Not only does she have 60 plus journal articles that have been highly influential, she has written very impactful books, which she has 11. She literally wrote the book on planetary gentrification. And she has another 4 manuscripts that are on the way. She is an incredibly productive scholar. According to the Journal of Urban Studies, Dr. Lees is the 17th most cited author in geography, and she is the only woman who's on the top 20 list. Now, while Dr. Lees is committed to rigorous scholarship, she also influences policy. For the past 3 years, Loretta has been advising the mayor of London as the chair of the London Housing Panel. She not only advises prominent politicians, she also assists grassroots advocacy organizations on anti-displacement strategies. Dr. Lee's steadfast activism on anti-displacement exemplifies how scholars can use their research to influence important public debates. In this year, the Urban Affairs Association acknowledged her work and awarded her the Activist Scholar Award. Now, if you couldn't already tell, I am a huge fan of Loretta's cutting edge and research and policy work. Her work immensely impacted me as a graduate student, and I continue to learn from her how important urban redevelopment processes impact everyday life. Her intellect and insights have garnered her much recognition. She is a highly sought after guest speaker, and she has given over 70 keynote worldwide addresses. And it seems that if you follow her on Twitter, and please do, she's incredibly active, it seems like she's delivering one of these lectures just about every 2 to 3 weeks. So I am so grateful that she has taken time out of her busy schedule, and I'm so honored that she is here with us today. So please help me welcome, I know you can't because it's silent, but I'll do the applause, Dr. Loretta Lees. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Derek, and thank you very much for inviting me. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, can everybody see that okay? I'm assuming silence means we can. Derek, can everybody see the screen okay?
Yep, I think
Brilliant,
so.
Thank you. Okay, great. So as I just said, thank you so much for inviting me. My head's exploding after Derek's introduction. Indeed, I've learned as much from Derek as he's learned from me, and I must say that up front. It's my pleasure to give this annual spring lecture at the Metropolitan Policy Centre at AU. And you can see here that I'm going to talk about gentrification and its worldwide impact. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quotation from the urbanist Richard Florida. So, urban theorist Richard Florida wrote in 2008 that the most successful cities and regions in the United States. Actually, you know what? Can I just stop sharing this? I think this might not be the right talk. Hang on, that's my embarrassment. Hang on a second. Let me just find the right one. Let's see. Let's close that up.
Well,
here we go.
Did you find it? Yeah, while you're...
I suddenly just realized that was not the same.
Okay.
That was an earlier version. Sorry about that. Better to get the right one now before I start. Okay. Yeah, that's better. We're in the post-pandemic world. Okay. So as I said, we're going to start with a quotation from Richard Florida from 2008. The most successful cities and regions in the United States and around the world may increasingly be inhabited by a core of wealthy and highly mobile workers leading highly privileged lives, catered to by an underclass of service workers living farther and farther away. So what I want to do in the talk now is argue that global society and space is moving towards a state of planetary gentrification, and this is leading to institutionalized apartheid, creating new spaces of exclusion, justified as progress and development, and even as helping the poor. So the result of planetary gentrification, I would argue, is social apartheid, the de facto segregation on the basis of class or economic status, in which an underclass is forced to exist separated from the rest of the population. Typically, a component in social apartheid, urban apartheid, refers to the spatial segregation of minorities to remote areas, usually the peripheries of cities. This is happening in cities around the world. But in the global north, gentrification also produces forms of apartheid that are not necessarily about spatial physical separation, but rather a form of mental phenomenological separation when sharing the same neighborhood, for example, in a new socially engineered mixed community. So before talking a bit more towards the end about the pandemic and the way I think gentrification might pan out now, I want to talk firstly about my thesis of planetary gentrification, because I want to talk globally today. So what is planetary gentrification? In my 2016 book, co-authored with Humbang Shin and Ernesto Lopez Morales, we argue that gentrification has unfolded at a planetary scale. It's not simply generalized like Neil Smith had claimed, but rather it has generalizations, and that's an important distinction. So this thesis on planetary gentrification highlights four things. It highlights, firstly, the ascendancy of the secondary circuit of capital and the globalized effects of financial capitalism. Secondly, it offers a global perspective that considers post-colonialisms, old and new, also analytical and everyday comparativisms. Third, it demonstrates planetary indigeneity. In other words, organic gentrifications that are not necessarily copies of those in the West. And fourthly, it problematizes translations, so things like west to east, north to south, and indeed vice versa. So we argue that gentrification is a phenomenon that cities worldwide have experienced, but it is not totally new in the 21st century to the global south, and gentrification has been and is being experienced through quite different types of urban restructuring. So our planetary gentrification thesis then is very open to conceptualization and comparison across both space but also time. To some extent, our thesis is a response to the Marxist geographer Andy Merrifield, who said, well, actually, he's called for a reloaded, or what he calls a reloaded urban studies, which calls for the removal of center-periphery binary thinking, acknowledging the emergence of multiple centralities across urbanizing spaces, and dispensing with all the old chestnuts between global north and global south, between developed and developed worlds, urban and rural, urban and regional, city and suburb, just as we need to dispense with old distinctions between public and private, state and economy, politics and technocracy. We also drew on work in our planetary gentrification thesis from the Subaltern Studies school, which has long questioned universalizing Western Marxist categories for studying historical, social and economic change in South Asia, for example, but who wanted to retain a Marxist analysis. We too separate ourselves from Marxism's universalist history of capital, the nation, the political, and from readings of class consciousness that don't travel well to contexts outside of the industrialized West. And like them, we also insist on a Marxist focus on the struggles of subaltern groups, the oppressed and the alienated in urbanizing societies. And this, of course, aligns with our critical political economy approach. Critically, we argue that the role of the state has been under-conceptualized in gentrification studies to date, and in so doing show how urban governance in metropolises in the global south has entered what the geographer Seth Schindler has called a territorial moment, in which municipal governments are increasingly focused on transforming urban space rather than improving populations. This has led, I would argue, to institutionalized, that is state-led, forms of social and urban apartheid. So what's shifting, or what's kind of creating this kind of shift, fostering this shift, or fostering this moment, I guess you could say? Well, Seth Schindler makes a number of useful points. That elites, not always the middle classes, prefer to invest in real estate in the global south rather than in the productive sectors of the economy, because there's a disconnect between capital and labour. And he says, and I have the quote up here on the screen, residents of, say, Lagos, Jakarta or Istanbul may reasonably assume that in cities of such size, they will be able to find a buyer for a luxury apartment in the future, while producing commodities for domestic consumption or for export is perceived risky in comparison. Middle classes in developing countries are not only local beneficiaries of the global regime of open markets and internationalized production, but they enjoy almost entirely positive and unproblematic connotations among many development agencies and governments. Thus, the construction of infrastructure and the development of a regulatory framework that encourages urban renewal and investment in real estate can be interpreted as attempts to reinforce the conditions for their further accumulation. So in brief, in the planetary gentrification work, we argue that governments in global south metropolises are excited at the possibility of accumulating capital at the very same time as remaking their cities. This is very much a reinvestment in the secondary circuit of capital, in other words, the built environment or real estate, and this is key to the process. Now, in some parts of the global south, this is happening at the same time as investment in the primary circuit of capital. That's industrial production. So, for example, in China, they've been doing both for quite some time. In other places, reinvestment in the secondary circuit is trumping reinvestment in the primary circuit. For example, places like Dubai, and of course, the result of this is the spectacular urbanization that you see there. But importantly, with planetary urbanization, rural places and suburban spaces have become integral moments of neo-industrial production and financial speculation, getting absorbed and reconfigured into new world regional zones of exploitation, into megalopolitan regional systems. A bit wordy, that one. So I'm going to talk first about remaking cities in the global south and then turn to remaking cities in the global north, following on then to talk about what I think the impacts of the pandemic might have been. So remaking cities in southern metropolises, I argue, causes social and urban apartheid, but it's done in different ways. The most subtle form of governance has been around the regulation and securitization of space. Often this is a sanitization of space in order to attract the middle classes or tourists. There's lots of discussion in Latin America, for example, about touristification. Now, one example is the slum pacification programs and slum tourism in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which of course has led to what we term in the book slum gentrification. And there's been lots of debate about what slum gentrification might mean, or indeed if there's been people actually pushed back against this notion. From the 1990s onwards, the Brazilian government followed an institutional approach to slum eradication. On the one hand, there were policies of aggressive land formalisation via police pacification of slums, with displacement pressure on the lowest segments of the original population who were not eligible for rehousing. On the other hand, there were state-financed policies, and here we see the financialisation, for rehousing the poor in areas beyond the city's outskirts. Rio de Janeiro is regarded as one of the few cases where favelas are very central and visible in the city centre, and therefore the city has undertaken one of the world's most explicit cases of state-sponsored slum gentrification. And to give you some examples, the Villa Ortrodromo favela was adjacent to the 2016 Rio Olympic site. This was a community built from the late 1960s onwards by fishermen who installed temporary dwellings on the edge of the pond. When the Rio Olympics was announced, it was home to around 450 families, many of whom lived in decent brick dwellings. Some were in more precarious ones. They all had access to water, sanitation, and energy supplies. 88% of the children and young people studied in the immediate areas. 65% of the workers had jobs in adjacent quarters. So it wasn't a failed slum in that kind of notion of it. Indeed, most residents of Villa Ortrodromo were homeowners. From 2007 onwards, the residents of Villa Ortrodromo were threatened with removal. And of course, here we see the governmental rhetoric, first as a landscape pollution threat, then as a danger to the safety of athletes housed in the Pan American Village, then as victims of the high levels of pollution in the pond that borders both the villa and the Olympic area, and then sometime later as occupiers of space needed for the construction of a motorway, and so on and so on. So work for the Olympic area began around sometime in 2013 with the aggressive removal of homes and community spaces. As in other Brazilian cities, state-sponsored housing programs offered a rapid solution for those to be displaced. That is, if they accepted relocation into very distant parts of the metropolitan ring, way, way, way from their own locations of employment, schooling, education, and everything else. So this particular favela was demolished in 2016. And indeed, a Washington Post magazine article in 2020, which went back and investigated during COVID, bizarrely, the fate of these displacees. Many of them had actually ended up moving into the nearby Asa Branca favela, which was renowned to be full of drug addicts and was actually a failed favela. So they moved from a successful favela and were displaced into a failed favela. In parallel, police pacification units were permanently installed in select favelas to enforce security. In 2011, police began to seize control of dozens of favelas from drug gangs to make the city safe in the run-up to the FIFA 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympics. Murder rates came down, and Sacova Rio, an organisation representing Rio's real estate professionals, estimated that in the 72 hours after police took the first 3 favelas, property prices there jumped by 50%. So you see this relationship between securitization and gentrification. A luxury boutique hotel with a rooftop pool went up in Vidigal. Middle-class Brazilians and foreigners began to snap up properties, keen on acquiring the ocean views. And these were seen as bargains in a city that has some of the highest real estate prices in the Americas. Slum pacification was physically expanded under the national government's Growth Acceleration Programme, which constructed cable cars that now connect favelas with downtown Rio. In addition, the $3.9 billion Moura Carioca program aimed to re-urbanize or relocate all of Rio's approximately 1,000 irregular settlements, in other words, slums. So the class-led symbolic appropriation of the favelas of Rio has given rise to land speculation, higher income newcomers, and the eventual socially economic exclusivity of gentrification in these places. But this is also a story of policy mobility. There are deep-seated historical connections, of course, between Latin America, Washington, D.C., where you guys are, and New York City, facilitated through the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, that give policy advice on these revancist programs. After reading about the success of Giuliani, the horrible man in the left there, and his zero-tolerance policing and cleaning up New York City, Rio de Janeiro's military police chief concluded it was well suited to the Rio neighborhood of Copacabana, and he began a pilot program there. They increased the number of surveillance cameras, radio patrol police, cracked down on unlicensed vendors and petty thieves, and then they expanded to discourage beggar encampments, removing their bedding, and they placed street children in shelters. And of course, there was a whole scandal that claimed that many street kids had actually been assassinated, unfairly targeting the city's poor and vulnerable. In the run-up to the 2014 World Cup, police violence increased. Of course, the pressure to sanitize increased, including beatings and the use of pepper spray. The program victimized Rio's most defenseless, cleaning up the streets, the tourists and the well-off. And of course, the irony is that Giuliani got a security consulting contract with Rio de Janeiro for the 2016 Olympics. Now, mega projects are another way that governments seek to accumulate capital whilst remaking their cities. One example we talk about in our book is the Eco-Atlantic mega project in Lagos in Nigeria. And Bill Clinton's inauguration comments for this development sum up the overinflated global aspirations of such projects. He said, quote, "It will work to improve the economy of Nigeria. All over the world, it will bring enormous opportunities. I am convinced that within 5 years, people will be coming from all over the world to see this." So it very much summarizes the kind of global aspirations. Indeed, the website says that it's the best prime real estate in West Africa. Quote, "It's a focal point for investors capitalizing on rich development growth based on massive demand and a gateway to emerging markets of the continent." At the same time as the Eco-Atlantic project was announced, Lagos's state government launched a statewide crackdown on waterfront slums, as the areas were now seen as prime waterfront real estate opportunity. The Otodo, Gadambi and Itodo communities of 2 of the largest informal fishing settlements in Lagos were demolished, with an estimated population of 40,000 people being displaced. These demolitions are continuing, with an estimated 300,000 people across 40 waterfront communities on the Lagos Lagoon likely to lose their homes. The project Eco-Atlantic, to protect Eco-Atlantic Island from the sea, developers constructed a sea wall, dubbed the Great Wall of Lagos. But while the wall protects the new city, it leaves neighbouring areas, mainly occupied by slums, even more vulnerable to rising sea levels. So it's very clear then that the agents of gentrification globally are no longer the kind of left liberal pioneer gentrifiers that we think about, and indeed their kind of contemporary version, the hipsters, for example, or artists. It's now much more likely to be the state, twinned with corporate capital, and powerful local or international developers. The impacts are the same globally: displacement of low-income groups and state-led, institutionalized social apartheid. And to just give you an example of one I visited here in Istanbul, Tarlabaşı in the top image is a so-called slum in the center of Istanbul, which was bulldozed, and the population relocated 40 kilometers outside of Istanbul to a newly built, what's called Toki housing, a kind of social housing estate. In the middle of nowhere, no facilities, no jobs, no anything. So eventually over time, the displacees began to move back and actually ended up setting up encampments in the original slum Tarlabaşı that they'd moved out of, because at least there was employment there. So ironically then, these large-scale urban renewal, regentrification schemes can be supported by the very populations they dispossess, and I find this really quite bizarre and interesting. So the question then of new forms of resistance to these state-led forms of gentrification in the global south becomes quite interesting. Will there be resistance, for example, and if there is, why and how? The key question is, and again using Seth Schindler's work, which I really like, and here he puts it quite well. He says, mainstream Marxian theory narrates how the proletariat became a class for itself in the context of being collectively alienated from means of production. But how do residents understand their place in the city, either individually or collectively, if they cannot realistically conceive of selling their labour power for a wage in an era of disconnected capital and labour? Are residents in 21st century metropolises subjectified by regimes of urban transformation in ways that activate them to participate in the transformation of cities? So do they get sucked in? Or does antagonism over access to urban space, infrastructure, and material flows of resources produce a collective consciousness the way that struggles on the shop floor once did? Really important questions. So now a little bit on kind of global questioning around planetary gentrification. And I want to talk a little bit in relation to post-socialist cities, because we talk a lot about global north and south, but there are lots of other examples of what we might call global. Despite the fact that scholars have been discussing gentrification in post-socialist cities for some time now, it's become fashionable of late for new scholars to question the applicability of the concept of gentrification for post-socialist cities. Andre Holm's study of the new build gentrification in Lodz and Leipzig found undeniable similarities with the spatial patterns in previous Western or Anglo-American studies, but pointed to different economic roots, as well as quite different and specific social consequences. Interestingly, and I went to Krakow just before COVID, Polish scholars have been amongst those most sceptical of the presence of gentrification itself in their cities, and more recently, the utility of Western conceptualizations of gentrification for Polish cities. But the consensus now, it seems, if indeed there is one, is that gentrification processes have occurred, are occurring in Polish cities, but in a different way and less intensively than in Western cities. More recently, others have asked, indeed following some of the work I did a decade ago, what Western theories might learn from the specificities of gentrification in non-Western post-socialist contexts. The Bucharest sociologist Liliviu Ceucha has lectured recently that using the concept of gentrification has the potential to expand the public agenda with conversations about shrinking affordable housing, uneven development, and structural violence in urban Eastern Europe. He has talked about the linkages between housing restitution in post-socialist cities, evictions, and gentrification. The planetary elsewhere, and here we have what was Kiev, which we don't pronounce Kiev anymore, if we're sensible, as Gentile has called it. And interestingly, this was one of the few cities not to experience gentrification for a number of reasons, including punitive anti-speculation taxes and a whole host of other reasons. So I think actually that's quite fascinating, and I wanted to put it up today, of course, in memory of the Ukraine war. Some other thoughts on planetary gentrification in post-socialist cities. Julie Wren, who's done a lot of work in China, concludes that it's impossible to weigh up gentrification's instrumental value against the need to develop global urban theory. To some degree, it's become more important, I think, to consider the timing and the speed of gentrification. London, as I discuss in a minute, has undergone processes of gentrification for a long time now, and it can be seen as hyper-gentrified. By way of contrast, places like Berlin have undergone a more rapid gentrification much more recently. And gentrification processes in Polish cities have occurred more slowly and less intensively than in Western cities, but the impacts are clear. Displacement, disenfranchisement of low-income groups in favour of wealthier in-movers in select spaces and places. So let's come back to the global north. I'm talking to you from London, you guys are in DC. Of course, in the global north, gentrification today also pushes lower income populations out of the city, as is happening in London right now, but it also forces low income groups to live cheek by jowl with high income groups, and I'll briefly discuss both forms of social apartheid in a minute. But first, a little bit about London. London, of course, now is in a situation that people have called, I guess, hyper-gentrification, extremely high land values, speculation. There was, up until the kind of kickback against Russian oligarchs, money laundering, although I'm sure money laundering will continue, a massive kind of number of overseas buyers and investment from China, from Russia, from the Middle East, all of which were part of this financialization around the kind of hyper-gentrification that really took off. For a long time, the only thing standing in the way of gentrification in London was council estates, or what you guys call public housing projects. For a long time, these were seen to be the kind of protectors of the poor, of low-income groups, the kind of pinion of affordability, of proper affordability in a city where property prices otherwise had gone nuts. But now, really, council estates are in the front line. They're in the kind of final brick in the wall against the gentrification, certainly of most of inner London. So I've been doing some work over the last years on this, looking at London's newest gentrification frontiers. And in the work that we did, we found that since 1997, over 54,000 units had either been demolished or were under threat of demolition in council estates of more than 100 units in London. A conservative estimate is that over 135,000 low-income residents have been displaced or are in the process of being displaced. The media in London has been speculating it was about 50,000, so this is significantly higher. So significant numbers of low-income people being pushed out. This is a large-scale displacement of working-class, poor, low-income groups out of London, and the Haygate estate has become symbolic of the gentrification of council estates in the capital. When the Haygate estate was slated for regeneration as a new mixed income community in the late 1990s, it was home to more than 3,000 people who were very settled in their homes, who liked their estate, who had no issues with their council estate. The estate now is pretty much, well, the estate was totally demolished, and the new build development that replaced it was rebranded as Elephant Park, and it's kind of sold as this new green development, and all of the units were sold off-plan in East Asia. So all 3,000 council tenants were displaced. So we did some work looking at this displacement. This was some of the first work really to try and get a sense of where people were moving to. So you can see that there are some differences here between the council tenants, those who are paying rents to the council, and the kind of traditional council tenant. They were obviously pushed out of their neighbourhood, but you can see that they were able to relocate predominantly somewhere else in London. Whereas in figure 2, we looked at leaseholders, those who'd bought their properties through the Right to Buy programme here and owned them. They could not afford to live anywhere in central London, and indeed many of them got pushed out of London altogether. So really interesting kind of spatial record about displacement here. So the impacts, what are the impacts of this? Well, there are social impacts, the destruction of social networks and family support. There are economic impacts. So homeowners, for example, loss of the investment, loss of their savings. Lots of people, loss of jobs because they have to move too far away to be able to commute to their original job. Cultural impacts, community support networks from churches to community centres, you name it, all of these broken, loss of sense of place. Health, mental and physical health issues, depression, suicide. I talked to lots and lots of doctors who talked about the realities of this on their doorstep as people were coming in increasingly anxious about what was happening. Schooling, many children, when they moved away, had to either travel to stay in the same school over long distances or indeed had to move schools altogether. So really significant impacts here in terms of displacement. Massive negative consequences for long-standing communities, because of course behind the numbers and the kind of spatial relocation maps, there are many harrowing stories. So here's one from the adjacent Aylesbury estate, which is about a third demolished as we speak, and the demolition is still in progress, although it's been kind of back and forth and blocked. So here's one person who said, from the very first day that the demolition was announced, the social bond was affected because people knew that ultimately they wouldn't be part of the same community. I've got a friend of mine, he ended up moving into a home somewhere just outside Sidcup in Kent. He's probably in his late 50s. He's lived here all his life. He's got people that would see him on a daily basis, and his family lives here in the area. He's now living there isolated just outside Sidcup, having broken all of his social ties. He's now suffering from severe depression. I think that's symptomatic of a lot of people. I mean, the number of people I've heard who've died during this decanting process, I've no way of keeping track of this, but for me, it's genocide. But then, what about people that did manage to move back onto their regenerated estate into the supposedly new mixed, socially mixed community? Two case studies here, one from Sonia R. Backey. She did some work in Islington, which is where I live in London, and she said, Islington is a representative case of a mixed neighbourhood that increases inequality, enhances school segregation and constrains housing careers within the neighbourhood, resulting in entrapment or outflow to peripheral outer London neighbourhoods. Mixing between private and social housing residents appears to be one of distant observation rather than a shared investment of social capital. So in other words, the kind of mixing that mixed communities policy was kind of selling on the packet wasn't happening at all, perhaps not surprisingly. In some research that myself and Mark Davidson did in another mixed development, we found one guy who said, the biggest thing I've seen in terms of benefit is the young girls getting jobs working at the hotel, you know, as maids. So it has given work, but saying that, they'll never be able to live here. When they get a bit older, they'll have to leave. You certainly don't have the vibrant working community where we all knew each other anymore. So even in the new build developments where things like hotels and kind of sports centres and stuff are built in, yes, you might be able to get a job there. And of course, these are also sold as kind of job-making enterprises, but you don't actually mix with those people. So a form of social tectonics where people kind of rub past each other of different social classes or different income groups, but don't actually mix. Even in the supposedly socially mixed high-rises that were built, this one, the Strata Tower, was adjacent to the demolished Haygate estate. Floors 2 to 10 are housing association affordable housing. All the floors above are private, and there are separate lifts for the housing association tenants and the private tenants. And again, there was a whole scandal about poor doors and rich doors in so-called mixed developments in London. Of course, Southwark Council has said that housing should not reinforce social distinctions and that this is critical for socially mixed or mixed income communities, but that's not what's actually happening on the ground. So the working classes and the middle classes rarely mix. They have separate life worlds. And in fact, it continues the social segregation that mixed communities policy was supposed to break down. So that's the background. That's a kind of quick foray into kind of global or planetary gentrification. So what, we're now 2022. So what is the likely future of planetary gentrification in a post-pandemic world? Of course, during COVID, gentrification pressures in the global north moved into the suburbs and smaller cities. But there was evidence that this was beginning to happen anyway. So in many ways, I think it was just a kind of bump up of a kind of process that had already begun. And this, of course, was the result of the unaffordability in inner urban areas caused by gentrification and other factors. But at the same time, gentrification also continued in inner cities. In 2020, with the global pandemic and the onset of national and indeed global economic recession, the media mooted the possibility of de-gentrification, and they do this every so often. But there is limited evidence to date on this, and as Derek Hyra and I have argued in a recent book chapter, gentrification, like capitalism, will no doubt continue, more closely connected to processes of financialisation than ever before. Indeed, financialisation is a key driver now. Financialisation in relation to gentrification involves the integration of property and financial markets through the restructuring of the real estate sector with input from urban policy. It makes property more attractive to financial investors seeking more liquid, less fixed investments. The restructuring of the real estate mortgage industry in the United States in recent decades is one example of state-led financialisation that expanded an urban market, that is commercial and housing mortgages, by exposing buyers to greater risk. And as we all know, this ultimately resulted in the creation of new inequalities and all sorts of deeply problematic issues. So I began this talk with a quote from Richard Florida in 2008. So what has he been saying more recently? Here's one just as the pandemic was kind of coming to fruition, I guess. He said, "The pandemic has worsened the new urban crisis of rampant gentrification, high living costs, class and racial division." And I don't tend often to agree with Richard Florida. In fact, I find a lot of his work on the creative class deeply problematic, particularly because it's been very influential in promoting gentrification. However, he's definitely right. I do think that the pandemic has worsened gentrification. How that plays out will be very different in the global north to the global south. And climate gentrification and the pressures from climate change are certainly going to come into play. Derek Hyra, for those of you who know his work, has discussed US investors' desires to buy low and sell high in certain minority rental markets as something that could trigger a new sixth wave of US gentrification, taking place disproportionately in cities, in southern US cities like Atlanta, Memphis, Birmingham, and Austin. So that kind of north-south, global south thing can now be quite an interesting but different take in terms of the US north and the US south in terms of cities. But what about the impacts of the new energy crisis we're now confronted with? The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 were correlated with first wave gentrification in the US. Commuting costs spiraled due to the combined effects of inflation, recession, high interest rates, and this called into question the survival of the American dream, suburban living, and fostered the back to the city movement. There is now a new energy crisis as oil and gas prices soar, a result of the war in Ukraine, which will escalate the cost of living, etc. Off the back of this crisis, there could well be new forms of disaster gentrification, where investors find new opportunities off the back of a crisis. Capital could buy up vulnerable businesses, buildings and homes on the cheap, and package and resell them to those wanting to move back to the city or into the city as an investment. Like in the oil crisis of the 1970s, the value of spatial capital for individuals and families will no doubt rise again. Living in the inner city will become attractive yet again, especially for those who work in the city, avoiding the need to commute. And if you're interested in this definition and kind of some earlier work that I did on spatial capital, check out a paper I wrote with Patrick Loretta on mobility and spatial capital and gentrification in Swiss core cities. So the notion of spatial capital, I think, is going to become increasingly important, and it fits really well with densification arguments, these constant pressures to densify instead of suburbanize. To combat environmental problems and to regulate urban sprawl, policymakers have been urging populations to live in high-density, compact cities. And this is not just in the global north, it's also in the global south, in which mobility practices will become more localized and less automobile dependent. So the fight against the institutional apartheid that planetary gentrification is causing and escalating is not easy, but it is important and it is urgent. Inclusive growth can only be achieved by rejecting this apartheid global city model. Indeed, UN Habitat in 2010 finally said cities must prevent social segregation and also, for the first time, gentrification. Social apartheid, as well as the increasing ghettoisation of urban spaces that is becoming widespread across the world. I agree, but I think we're going to have some really complex times now post-pandemic, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens. Okay, so thank you very much. I will exit this.
Loretta, thank you so much for taking us on a tour around the world related to gentrification prior to the pandemic, and then your scary prediction that coming out of the pandemic, things will likely get worse. I have a question. I mean, you mentioned the oil crisis and inflationary pressures, the rise of goods, and how that may lead to people having a greater interest being in a dense environment where they don't need to get in a car, they don't need to pay for gas. And I'm wondering, there's another pressure related to real estate investment, and that's rising interest rates. To hold down inflation, many policymakers, especially within the US, there's a feeling that the Federal Reserve Board will rise interest rates, which might make it harder for real estate investors to get the capital to make the purchase. So I'm just curious, kind of the rising interest rate environment, how do you think that will play out, and will that slow down in some places the trend that you feel is on an upward trajectory coming out of the pandemic related to gentrification?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Derek, because the Bank of England has literally just risen the interest rate here today. It was on the news tonight, but it's still at an incredibly low level. And we've got to remember that the levels of interest rates are the lowest, are still incredibly low, both in North America and across Europe. You know, they're certainly not what they were in the 1970s and 1980s, so we've got some way to go yet. So I think unless they go up that high, and I think in most places there will be lots of pressure to avoid that from governments and from people via the governments, etc. So I think we're in a different time really to what we were, for example, in the 70s and 80s. So I actually see the interest rates going up as slightly less of a problem, because I don't think they'll zoom up to like 20-25% like they were doing here in the 80s. But saying that, the cost of living in general is you know, food, energy, everything is going to go up. So I don't think it's going to be the kind of owner-occupier type gentrification. It's going to be investors buying these properties to then rent out or to do A, B, C, and D with. So I think it's going to be a different kind of gentrification than that initial back to the city pioneer gentrifier type stuff, certainly in the US in the 70s.
All right. As a follow-up question, if you feel that the rise in interest rates, which is minor, right, compared to the context of the 70s and the 80s, if that interest rate adjustment isn't really going to slow down anything, how do tenants and residents fight the pressures that they're facing? What are some of the tools that you would offer to academics and activists to try to manage this gentrification process so that there are better outcomes for residents in terms of staying in place, but even if they stay in place, to make sure that they benefit from the new income and the new residents that come into their neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, as you know from my work, Derek, that there's very different strategies and tools for different parts of the world, and there's no singular kind of kickback. And at the end of the day, I think one of the most important things is about people getting together as a community and fighting back with that kind of support. It's very difficult for individuals to fight back against this. And in the most successful cases, it has been where people have come together. And I know that's a general statement, but that's the easiest way to answer it, because it's very particular, you know, and you know, fighting back from a rental property that's being taken over by an international investor is different to fighting back from a public housing project that's been taken over by the state through mixed communities policy. The strategies are different. But I think one thing that's really important is that as academics, we need to be pushing gentrification. You can see that UN Habitat now has, well, since 2010, had kind of finally woken up to the fact, for a long time, they were selling gentrification as a good thing, that we should be gentrifying cities, which is bizarre. But in 2010, they finally came around to realizing it's a negative thing. So as academics, if we could, push this up the policy agenda, that will help communities in of themselves as well, because it will get local officials, policymakers to enact processes that block, which there has been some success even in the US on that.
Yeah, great. All right, so at the annual spring lecture, we had Mindy Fullylove and her concept of root shock in terms of displacement, the negative health effects of being displaced. You mentioned some of that in your own work. We've also had Lance Freeman to the Metropolitan Policy Center to talk about gentrification. And Dr. Freeman sort of sees more positive aspects, potential positive aspects of gentrification with his work. And I guess I think really know where you stand and fall, but I guess the question is, are there any times where a gentrification process unfolds and there actually are tangible benefits to low and moderate income people? Or is this completely a negative process with negative outcomes?
I mean, in my mind, from the work, certainly from the research that I've done, it's been overwhelmingly negative. And I think one of the things is that when Lance Freeman was doing that early work on socially mixed or neighborhoods that were becoming socially mixed, that was kind of the early days. And it's really took off massively since then. And that the pressures of gentrification and the displacements have took off massively since then. So I talk about space and time. If you were to measure gentrification in 1990 in a socially, in a neighborhood that becomes socially mixed versus in 2000 versus in 2022, you're going to get a very different kind of viewpoint. And of course, as social scientists, we know that. But we tend to kind of hang on to older literatures that say A equals B, but we can't do that. You've got to recognize that things change over time. And gentrification is a process that has mutated over time. Certainly it's sped up in some places, but it's also slowed down in other places. And if you focus on space and time, and I'm a geographer, I'm obsessed with space, but actually time's important as well, and speed. I think you get a kind of sense of things.
All right, as a follow-up question, you mentioned that the processes or dynamics of gentrification change over time. And gentrification was coined by Ruth Glass, right? The UK scholar in 1964. And I think she really focused on the gentry, right, of the newcomers. And you really laid out an argument that maybe we shouldn't focus so much on the newcomers. Maybe it's the new investors or the new politicians that are bringing in new types of real estate development. And I'm curious in terms of what would you advocate for? We have scholars on the call. We have new scholars. We've got senior scholars who are studying neighborhood change. Where would you tell them is sort of the place that they should be intervening with future work in terms of unpacking and understand the new complexities of gentrification as it's unfolding in different places around the world?
I think the first place they need to go is to city councils. So certainly the work that I've been doing in London has been trying to persuade local councils that, for example, mixed communities policy causes gentrification because of the way that it pans out. And of course, mixed communities policy, what it says on the box is a good thing. It is good to have socially mixed communities, and it has lots of positives. But the way that it's panned out and the way that it comes through in regeneration, it doesn't cause that. So in my mind, it's about getting scholars to talk particularly to their, kind of city leaders, in inverted commas, and all the kind of policymakers below those city leaders, which is one of the reasons I took on chair of the London Housing Panel. Because, of course, Mayor Sadiq Khan does not like being told that you know, he's just destroying social housing, but he's not building enough social housing, and there's a massive affordability crisis due to gentrification. But sometimes you just have to say what you need to say.
A question that I want to ask related to some of the data that you presented, which I found fascinating with London's redevelopment of the States, is that the people who bought, and the right to buy was supposed to be an anti-displacement process, procedure. Well, then it comes to pass that the people who were leasing and didn't buy seem to end up closer. They still got displaced, but they stayed within London. But the people who bought got forced further out. So what does that say about the right to buy policy? Was it a failure, or do you still think maybe there was some positives in terms of the equity people were able to get when they still got displaced? So I'm just curious your thoughts on the right to buy policy in the context of what you presented.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the right to buy policy was a neoliberal Thatcherite policy that was brought in to make everybody in Britain a homeowner, including low-income groups who lived in council housing. They could buy their own council property. But on many of these big high-rise brutalist council estates that I've been working on, it was actually very difficult to even get a mortgage to buy those units. So it's a bit different to buying, you know, a kind of garden city council house. So there is a difference between buying on some of these big 60s brutalist council estates. It is a real problem that leaseholders have been the most severely impacted by this. They have lost massive amounts of money. They've been treated really, really badly, and they've been kind of ejected way out of London. But there is a policy change here now. So, for example, Sadiq Khan recently, we're now buying back right to buy properties. So the whole thing has gone full shift, and we're going back and trying to buy up properties from leaseholders on council estates and give them back to council tenants, recognising that this was a problem. You're muted.
Sorry, trying to multitask, look at my phone, unmute.
That was like me with my two different presentations.
Well, the context of that, everyone should know that I think you pulled up the presentation that you were
the one I was going to give 2 years ago
before the pandemic, and we had to cancel. So I'm glad you pulled up the
No, I'm glad I realized I'd be halfway through it and like, oh my goodness.
So the question is that came through was about sort of differentiating the different types of real estate investors. I think that the argument that you're making and that others have made is that there are large financial investors that are international corporations who are leading this sort of gentrification trend around the world. But what about the small mom and pop real estate investors that come in? Do you see a difference when you have a community that's redeveloping with a large multinational and international financing versus a small local real estate or a mom and pop? Are there different patterns and different trends related to different types of investors who are coming into communities that are gentrifying?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I guess more recently I've been focusing on the big international investors because it's been large areas I've been looking at that have been gentrified rather than kind of, you know, smaller units. But I do know that those big international investors also target smaller units. So I think one of my PhD students might be on the Zoom today, and she's been doing a project on the building that she grew up in Kensington in London. And it's been threatened by international developers, you know, and this is like a 4-unit building. You know, it's not there's like 4 families living in it, not 3,000 plus people. So I think certainly in London, there's less of that kind of mom and pop stuff. I think maybe in cities outside of London in the UK, there might be a bit more of that. But also it has, there's kind of an ethnic dimension to it. So there are certain ethnic groups that kind of have large real estate portfolios and stuff like that, and do different kinds of regenerating or investing. And I guess the other thing I haven't talked about is the kind of ethnic dimension to the displacement, which, you know, we talk about a lot about social cleansing in London, whereas in the United States, there's lots of work done on kind of, you know, for example, your own work on Cappuccino City, where, you know, it's kind of the black population out, the white population in kind of crude terms. But it's becoming increasingly clear here that there is an ethnic dimension, but it's more complex here because it's a much more these areas are much more multicultural in many ways. They're less kind of homogeneous in terms of ethnicity. But that's something that British researchers are only really beginning to tackle now.
Yeah, you hit my follow-up question was going to be about how race and ethnicity affect the processes, but also relate to the outcomes of gentrification. Of course, with my own work, I've focused a lot on race and Blackness and how that relates to the dynamics of change, but also the outcome. And I'm curious with your international work, not just what's happening in London, but with looking beyond London, are you seeing that the processes of gentrification are being mediated and impacted by race and ethnicity and different social categories? And also, is it disproportionately affecting people of color in the communities around the world? So yeah, if you could elaborate a little bit more on race and ethnicity and how it relates to gentrification, that would be great.
Certainly in the global north, I would say yes, but I think in the global south, you know, if you look at Lagos, for example, you know, the people who are being displaced are Black Nigerian. The people who are moving in are wealthy Black Nigerian, plus perhaps the odd expat white person from wherever. So I think the racial politics there are different. You'll see that one of my slides at the beginning of my talk had a picture from South Africa of kind of, I guess, the equivalent of kind of Black yuppies, I guess, who are moving into gentrifying neighborhoods. So again, the racial politics is quite complex there because you've got this kind of growing Black middle class in South Africa that want to live downtown in a way that they didn't before. So I think quite simply, my response is that the context is just very different everywhere. The racial politics in the United States are fraught. You know, they've got a really particular history that doesn't play out even in the UK in the same way. And I think as gentrification scholars, we just haven't got our heads around this beyond the US yet, around the kind of racial politics. You know, certainly in the Netherlands, a lot of scholars have been looking at the way that white Dutch gentrifiers have displaced Turkish, what would have been kind of shopkeepers predominantly, or had small local businesses and lived nearby. So that, again, a racial dimension there, but in a different way. So I think there's a lot of work now that gentrification studies kind of needs to wake up to, around kind of race, ethnicity beyond the US, which has been a kind of, leader on this kind of work, I think.
We are running out of time. I think we are over time, but I have one more question. And the question is about, again, policies that you think that can intervene to manage the gentrification or mitigate the displacement pressures. And we talked about the right to buy, but I'm curious to get a better understanding from you where you see the role of estate housing or public housing in the US. Is public housing the means to lessen the burdens that are placed on low and moderate income people who are feeling pressures, or do you feel that we shouldn't be intervening in the housing markets per se? Maybe we should be intervening at the capital markets and regulating the flows of capital. So where do you see the intervention, and is housing policy the place where we should be focusing our efforts?
I mean, I think quite clearly, if you listen to the end bit of my talk where I talked about and explained what we mean by financialization in gentrification processes, capital and housing and policy are completely connected. You cannot disaggregate the three of those. So you cannot just advocate for housing without also dealing with capital. You need to be doing both. And, as much as I believe that the state needs to step up and protect marginalized people, and there should be a welfare support network for the poor around housing and other stuff, we also need to recognize that, the state can't necessarily fund all of that. So we do need to, for example, have rent stabilization, rent control policies that mean that private rental accommodation can also be affordable for low income groups. But of course, there are lots of complexities and lots of kickbacks and lots of contextual differences in different cities around that.
Yeah. Well, Loretta, I want to say thank you for spending your time with us and for the lecture. It was incredibly stimulating. And I know we're going to keep the dialogue going. Dr. Lees is likely to leave Leicester and come to the United States, to Boston University, to head one of their prominent urban research centers. So I have a feeling that we're going to get you to Washington, D.C. and be in person, and to be collaborating with some of our students and our faculty fellows and some of the advocacy groups that are here in Washington, D.C., because as many people on the call know, that Washington is one of the most gentrified cities in the United States. And Dr. Lees, we need all your help in terms of figuring out how to manage the process better so that we can mitigate the displacement that has been happening for at least the last 10 years here. And I'm sure you're going to see some similar but yet different dynamics happening in Boston. So we look forward to collaborating with you in the future. And again, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much. And just to say what wonderful work that the School of Public Affairs does as well, and has really helped in terms of thinking through processes of gentrification in DC and elsewhere. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.